Hello everyone, my name is Will Farmer, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about bereavement and grief. So I want to start us off here with a quote. So to read it off, we must learn how to die in order to learn how to live. We must learn how to die in order to learn how to live. I want you guys to let that sink in, and I want you to hold on to it throughout our discussion because I'm going to come back to it, and it's going to do a lot to put our discussion into context and to help us gain something good from this discussion. And again, I will talk about that more. But as you guys have already been presented with, I'm going to be pulling some quotes and concepts from the book Tuesdays with Morrie. Uh, so the authors of this book are Morrie Schwartz and Mitch Albom. Mitch is on the right, Morrie is on the left. And we see, so this book's mostly about Morrie. It's about a sociology professor from the 1980s who develops ALS. And he spends the last year of his life meeting every week with his old student Mitch to discuss some thoughts and feelings and experiences that they're both having in relation to his progressive loss of function and eventually death. So I think this book can do a lot for us to add color to our discussion, and I would highly recommend reading it. But moving on. So I'm going to engage with the research here on bereavement and grief in a way that is framed by these questions. So the first question I have is, what is the relationship between grief and bereavement? Why does it seem like these two things always come up together in the discussion? And how can we really clearly understand them together? And what perhaps does a healthy relationship between these two things look like? Next, I want to talk about where this relationship can get complicated, right? What are some things that can make it harder for people to grieve well? We'll get into the specifics there. And then finally, I want to talk about this in the context of aging. I want to talk about how there are different expectations for children and for adults. And I want to talk about how do I put it? What people can make of this experience, especially considering that they might carry it with them throughout their lives. So starting off with some definitions, I like to offer some clarity here. I'm going to pull from what I find interesting about these definitions. So for bereavement, they mention that it is not limited to death, right? People can be bereaved of something more abstract, like a relationship or an opportunity, or maybe even something more concrete, like I suppose a meal. Although I wouldn't use that suggestion because it might make light of the intensity of the experience. But just know that in terms of the definition, while we will talk about death a lot, that people can be bereaved and have bereavement experiences in a way that is not limited to loss of life. And then next we have grief. So grief is described as a response to bereavement. So that does a lot to frame their relationship for us right here. We understand grief as the response to bereavement, and we now understand clearly that people can grieve the loss of life, but they can also grieve the loss of something more abstract or something, again, not related to explicitly death. So, talking about what healthy coping or healthy grief looks like in response to bereavement, we're going to contrast two different perspectives. One of them is older, and one of them is newer. The new research, or excuse me, the new perspective that research supports. Again, this comes from research by I believe it's Strobe and Shute or Shut. I apologize if I mispronounced that. But the old perspective comes from the grief work hypothesis. Uh, and what used to be a popular idea was that people used to think that in order for people to get over a bereavement experience, that they need to grieve and they need to grieve some more, and that they just continue grieving until issues with bereavement are over. There's no more concern, right? There's no more tears left, or something like that. Um, this contrasts very heavily with the modern perspective that research would pose, which is the dual process perspective. And what this perspective suggests is that grieving is one part of a process in adapting to loss, right? So what you need to consider here when they say that is that they're suggesting that healthy grieving involves engaging but also disengaging with grief, right? They really point out that for people to be able to grieve well, they need to be able to pull out of that state for a while and to be able to think about and to act on something else. But what we'll see here, and we'll talk more about this, is that healthy grieving is suggested to occur in cycles throughout the life. Again, people are expected to re-engage with their grief in a new way and to go through another cycle of grief. And we'll talk more about how that looks further on when we talk about aging. But just know that healthy grieving involves cycles of grieving where people are able to engage and disengage with this state. I want to talk about some of the general findings in the research. So the first thing I want to point out is that a lot of this research is qualitative. So what this means is that they're really trying to understand the lived experience of these people who have these bereavement experiences. And they're pulling themes from these sort of discussions or conversations that they're happening, that they're having, trying to understand their lived experience. And one of the things that came out is that a lot of people describe the grieving process as something that does not necessarily have an end. They say that it is something that they continue to carry with them throughout their life. And a lot of them even reported that even the idea of their grief experience being something that should have an end, they find that offensive, right? And that's a curious and interesting outcome, and it really ties into this next finding that comes from a lot of this qualitative research, where a theme comes out that a lot of people report bereavement to be something that becomes identity relevant. So when I say identity relevant, what I mean is that it changes the way that people see themselves and the way they see their relationships with other people. So you could almost imagine how when something becomes identity relevant, considering grief and bereavement, that someone suggesting, hey, this experience with loss that you have, it's terrible, and yes, you are entitled to an emotional response to it, but the idea that this response being something that should end, right, knowing that this experience with loss has now become identity relevant, we can almost start to put the picture together as to how people might be offended. It might even be received as suggesting that they are denying a part of their identity. And that's something we want to be aware of when we're thinking about bereavement. Next, I have a quote here from Tuesdays with Morrie that I think does a really good job of engaging with this identity relevance idea. So here he says, "I find myself drawn to these people on the other side of the world, whom I have never met. Because I am grieving, I feel more connected to others' grief." This is fascinating here because what I am drawing from this quote is that as a result of his experience with bereavement, the author Morrie is now able to recognize and relate to bereavement and grief in other people. This is starting to sound a lot like compassion and empathy. Now, I'm not here to talk about those two concepts, but I do think it's really important to say it and to frame it this way because it shows really the impact, the real impact that these bereavement experiences have on people. All right, next I'm going to be getting into some factors related to the bereavement event itself that maybe might contribute to a more difficult time in the grieving process. So we see that lack of preparation is one of these issues, right? So to give an example, let's just say you have a case, you have two different scenarios where we have two different people who die of a heart attack. Before the heart attack, one of them was in and out of the hospital with heart-related health concerns, while the other had not been to the hospital and was not expressing health concerns. You could imagine that the loved ones of the individual who has been in and out of the hospital, that they unfortunately might see this coming and would have had the ability to plan for it, right? Because if you think about a case where someone is bereaved of a caretaker, uh, you you would imagine that this person who is bereaved is now confronted with this very real situation where they're having to provide for themselves in a way that they are not familiar with. And this could have a real impact on their ability to grieve well. Um, Next, we have scale of the associated loss. So just to give an example here, right? Let's say I was to be bereaved of my friend. Let's say I lost my friend in an accident, or I lost my mother in an accident. If we compared these two situations, right? Not to put my friend under the bus, but I am going to grieve more for the loss of my mother, right? And the reason I'm going to grieve more is because that relationship meant more to me. and the loss that I'm going to feel in response is going to be greater, right? It's going to be of a greater scale when compared to this other scenario. So that's what you can think of when when that comes up. In terms of the frightful context associated with the loss or death, so pulling, I guess, from my personal perspective, right, knowing that I'm an American and that I believe we are both myself and other Americans participate in a peace-loving culture, you would imagine that we would have more intense feelings surrounding the loss of someone's life if they were to, say, die in a combat zone as opposed to dying peacefully in their sleep, right? We might have some hard feelings to deal with about, being worried that this person that we are bereaved of may have been in pain or that they may have been scared in the final moments of their life. That's something that we are going to have to deal with in our grieving experience. It might make it more intense or more difficult. Now, getting at some factors related to the individual. So we see that like culture can play a role in how people grieve and their ability to grieve well. So to give an example, unfortunately, let's just say, what if someone died in a way that is viewed as shameful, right? What if the context surrounding the way someone died is culturally suggested to be shameful? That would make it harder for a person to talk about it and think about it. And what if also the culture puts shame on us for the way that we grieve, for the way that we mourn, right? What if, crying or isolating oneself, what if this is viewed as shameful? That is a way that culture can contribute to maybe making the grieving process more difficult or easier. Next, we have available resources. So this really kind of comes back around to lack of preparation, right? You could use the same example where, let's say, an individual is bereaved of a caretaker. Well, now they have to provide for themselves in a very real way that they are, excuse me, are not familiar with doing, right? So now maybe they don't have time to reach out to their social networks and to grieve with them and to have a positive experience in being able to share that feeling with someone. They might have to work or to clean or to take care of someone else. They might have other more immediate responsibilities. We also have previous experiences with loss are going to affect this. So this is a really sad thing to say, but if you have an individual who has been bereaved before, right? They've experienced significant loss. You can imagine that if they experience significant loss again, as terrible as that is, and not to diminish the feelings that they might have, that unfortunately this position that they find themselves in might not be new to them, and so they might have more awareness about how to go about dealing with these things. And then finally, we see that relationships play a role in people's ability to cope. I actually think that this next slide starts engaging with this better, so I'm going to go ahead and jump there. So when we talk about relationships, the real benefit that people get from relationships is social support. And we see that the presence of social support is one of the greatest predictors of people's ability to grieve well. We also see that lacking social support has strong associations with overwhelming grief and even the development of depression. So this really starts to highlight how relationships matter and really what they can do to help people in terms of having a bereavement experience. Another quote here that comes from Tuesdays with Morrie that really emphasizes the importance of social relationships here. Without my family and my dear friends like you, I don't know if I would be able to handle this all alone. I think this is something that we can all relate to. It's a very human thing, right? To want to share our lives with other people, especially when times are hard, and to be able to have the validation of sharing the struggle and the experiences with others. I think we all know what it feels like to be alone, whether or not we've had intense bereavement experiences. All right. Now let's get into the aging perspective. So talking about maybe some ways that children and adults are different. Here are some sort of boxes that are checked when children are grieving well, right? We see that for children to grieve well, they need to be able to accept loss, to accept pain, to accept a world without the deceased, and to be able to feel like they still have a connection with the deceased in the new life they're creating. Um, we can see that some of these boxes might be a little more difficult to check for younger children, right? So really young children struggle with the concept of permanence. Young children might have trouble differentiating between their maybe someone in their life being gone as opposed to away, right? They might not understand the difference between those two things. So we can see that it's harder for younger individuals to grieve well in some cases. A quote that really emphasizes the importance of one of these elements of grieving well is that death may end a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. And we see the importance of being able to have this relationship with the deceased, even carries for adults as well. So we see here are some more boxes to be checked to represent healthy grieving in older adults. And we see that the big difference here is that older adults are expected to take action in their greater environment in a way that helps them grieve, right? So the difference here is that older adults are expected to control their environment more and to act in a way that is going to help them grieve better through things like seeking social support, going to therapy, adjusting to loss, and also again maintaining this connection with the deceased. We can see how some of these things would be very hard for children and why we don't expect it of them. So, for instance, a lot of children have their social networks provided for them. Um, Most children would have therapy appointments and things like that. Those would be set up for them by their parents. So you can imagine it would be hard for a child to do these things on their own. And in a lot of cases, we wouldn't expect it of them. So getting back to the bigger picture of what healthy grieving looks like and putting it into aging context, we see that grief is reevaluated throughout life, right? This reevaluation really references what I talked about earlier when I talked about cycles. They talk about how their relationship with the deceased takes on new meaning as they go throughout their life, right? They're taking this new meaning, they're re-engaging in a new cycle of grief, and we see that from a lot of the qualitative research talking about people's lived experiences with grief, we find that as they continue throughout their lives and as they go through a new grief cycle, as they reevaluate and as they make new meaning out of their relationship with the deceased, that a lot of them report being able to have appreciation for things which they used to take for granted, right? So we see that this reevaluation, as much as it comes from something that was very negative, but that they are able to grow and to bring something positive out of this experience. I think that's something important to point out about healthy grieving throughout the life. So getting back to those questions that I asked earlier, to answer them, getting at the relationship between bereavement and grief, we see that, as I suggested, grief occurs in response to bereavement, and we see that healthy grieving, again, is experienced in cycles. For people to grieve well, they need to be able to engage and to disengage from grieving. Talking about how grieving can become complicated, we see that there are specific factors related to the individual or the bereavement event that can make healthy coping difficult or easier. And then talking about this from an aging perspective, we see that we don't expect the same thing in healthy grieving from children and adults. We expect a little more from adults in terms of agency and control. And we also see that, again, getting back to those cycles, we see that there is reevaluation of the relationship with the deceased throughout their life, and that this helps them, again, draw new meaning and helps them to grow and appreciate things that they did not before. So why did I talk about this, and why did I choose to frame it this way? Well, the first truth that we have to deal with is that we are all headed towards bereavement, right? Bereavement is a very real part of life, um, in that death itself is a real part of life. And so, in order to be more compassionate to ourselves and to others, it might really help us to understand what these experiences look like and how people respond to them. And then kind of getting back to what I said about helping us understand what these experiences look like, as terrible as it is to experience such a loss, we see that not every outcome has to be negative, right? That people are able to reevaluate, people are able to draw meaning, and ultimately this does represent an opportunity for us to grow. And if we are able to see it that way, maybe that will help us in our own experiences with bereavement. So finally, I want to leave you with some words as I started with. We must learn how to die in order to learn how to live, right? Morrie is suggesting here that we are not really living until we are appreciating. And I think that's important to consider even amidst such a sad topic like bereavement. So thank you for tuning in, and here are my references.